Hello and welcome to our Thursday evening Bible study, though of course it's not necessarily Thursday evening when you may be watching this. I'm Edwin Weber, one of the pastors at St. Mark's Lutheran of Spokane, whose ministry enables this video series. This is sort of a redo video. I've gotten some feedback that my audio wasn't so great on my first copy, so you may see this. This is the Isaiah in Context video. And as that implies, we're starting a new series today, a series on the book of Isaiah, which was our most requested book following our last session on Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. Unfortunately, 5 weeks is just not enough time to get through the whole book of Isaiah. Isaiah is one of the longest books of the Bible. It's 66 chapters long, and it's just perhaps too much for us to do as a survey, especially since folks requested we do a deep dive into one of the prophets. And what is more, it is a book of it's a very complex book. It is one of composite authorship. It represents a wide range of dates. It even expresses a whole range of different literary styles, which include oracular writing, narrative sections, pseudo-apocalyptic literature, poetry, and song, all contained in this book. So rather than doing a broad survey, me and the other pastors thought that it would be nice if we could do a deep dive into just one section of Isaiah. And so our study this winter, we will be looking at chapters 40 through 55, which is sometimes called Second Isaiah. Now you may be wondering, why is it called Second Isaiah, or why would we start in the middle of the book instead of at the start? And that brings me here and now to this session, this Isaiah in Context video, where I want us to look at the broad scope of the whole book of Isaiah first, as it comes to us in our Bible. And I think that after this discussion today, you will understand both why we selected Second Isaiah for this study, and also understand the overarching themes of the whole book of Isaiah, as well as its major sections and themes. So first, I want us to look at the book of Isaiah as a whole, as it is given to us in the Hebrew Bible. There are 66 chapters which reflect a broad span of both history and style of writing, as I've already mentioned. Now, scholars have long noted that there is a significant change in the style of writing that happens starting in chapter 40 of Isaiah. And this shift is one that the tone is fundamentally shifts from one that speaks about judgment that comes from God to God's people, and shifts to one where God speaks comfort and consolation from God to God's people. Judgment to consolation. Major shift here. Now, we're pretty certain, and we know the reason for this consolation is that Judah, the southern kingdom, has been conquered and its people led into exile. An event which we can actually very accurately date to 587 BCE. However, we know that the historical prophet Isaiah was in ministry back in the 8th century, probably around 738. And that would have been quite a span of time to be written by one person, which has given rise to this notion maybe that Isaiah does have more than one author here. And interestingly enough, I only just recently learned this, Isaiah is not actually mentioned by name after chapter 39, something I find particularly interesting. Now, if you want, you can do, shall I say, a little bit of a comparison and contrast. If you like, take a look at these two passages, one from chapter 3 and one from chapter 43. And you might notice some differences in the tone, the style, the audience that the author is addressing, and ways and approaches here. So you may find that interesting if you like to compare those two passages. Now, this early division that scholars discerned between 1st and 2nd Isaiah, or Proto-Isaiah and Deutero-Isaiah, was originally sort of distinguished, and still is in many ways today, that 1st Isaiah is really strongly associated with the historical prophet. 2nd, or Deutero-Isaiah, is associated with the period of exile, and written to a people who are actually in Babylon. Now later, a 3rd section was sort of discerned, 3rd Isaiah, or Tertio Isaiah, which is very closely in style from 2nd Isaiah, and perhaps why it wasn't originally distinguished. But the main difference is that 3rd Isaiah seems to address the people who have actually returned to the land at the conclusion of the exile. And again, we can fairly accurately date this to certainly no earlier than 539 BCE, though 520 is probably a little bit more realistic. Now, traditional claims about authorship of the book of Isaiah has held that the whole book was composed by the 8th century prophet. And these other contexts to which the prophet is speaking, those prophets of the people in exile and the people after exile, have been explained as incredible feats of prophecy. And I do say incredible because they would be extraordinary because, for example, 2nd Isaiah mentions by name Cyrus the Great, the 6th century Persian emperor. And that mention by name is quite amazing if it is being made all the way back in the 8th century. Now, I am not going to tell you definitively that this isn't the case. Many scholars hold a variety of different views. Some argue for the traditional authorship, some for this composite authorship. All of them agree that we don't know for 100% certain. We don't have a manuscript out there written in Isaiah's handwriting, for example. But what I will speak to is me and my personal faith and my belief. For me, it doesn't affect my faith if the historical prophet wrote it all or if it was written by 3 or more authors. For me, it doesn't change the fundamental truths that are revealed in the book, nor does it cease to be a very powerful witness to God's relationship with humans in both times of great rebellion and great need. It is Word of God all the same. Now, the next thing I want us to do is look a little more closely at the historical Isaiah, his 8th century ministry, his context, the time in which he lived, what was going on in the world. Naturally, that would really influence the historical prophet. And because it's going to tell us a lot about this person, this book that he wrote, these early writings that then perhaps inspired others to write in a similar style, address similar contexts. And so actually I want to start out with Isaiah's call story, which I must say I think is one of the most amazing call stories in the Bible. You probably are tired of hearing me say that because I do say that a lot. So here we are, Isaiah 6. Isaiah writes, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lofty, and the helm of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs were in attendance above him, and each had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, and with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. And one called to another and said, 'Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory.' The pivots on the thresholds shook at the voices of those who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me! I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. Yet my eyes have seen the Lord, the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphs flew to me, holding a live coal that had been taken from the altar with a pair of tongues. The seraph touched my mouth with it and said, Now that this has touched your lips, your guilt has departed, and your sin is blotted out. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And I said, Here I am, send me. And he said, Go and say to this people, Keep listening, but do not comprehend. Keep looking, but do not understand. Make the mind of the people dull, and stop their ears, and shut their eyes, so that they may not look with their eyes, and listen with their ears, and comprehend with their minds, and turn, and be healed. Then I said, How long, O Lord? And he said, Until cities lie waste without inhabitation, and houses without people, and the land is utterly desolate, until the Lord sends everyone far away, and vast is the emptiness in the midst of the land. Now, it is an amazing call story, and we get God's first primary commission to Isaiah. Right at the call of his own call story, Isaiah details that the nature of this call is one that primarily speaks judgment against God's people. And we also get a great historical detail. I love this, that Isaiah was called, this vision that Isaiah had, happened in the same year that King Uzziah died. And we can fairly reasonably date that to the year 738 BCE. So we have a really good idea of when Isaiah's ministry started. Now, Isaiah's ministry is also in part detailed in the book of Kings. Perhaps you remember that from our last Bible study. What I think is really interesting is that this Bible passage from 2 Kings 18, I should say chapter 18, verse 13, through chapter 20, verse 19. This passage was copied it was copied word for word from Kings into the last section of 1st Isaiah. And it was probably done by a later editor, maybe even the final editor who put the whole book of Isaiah together. Now, this seems to suggest that Isaiah's ministry, because of this passage in Kings, where the ministry ends, how 1st Isaiah ends, it probably means that Isaiah's ministry ended during the reign of Hezekiah, or perhaps soon afterwards, maybe as late as the year 688. Now, if that being the case, that would mean that Isaiah would have been in ministry some 54 years at that point, which is an incredible feat today, nevertheless, in Isaiah's time. Now, this time frame for Isaiah's ministry gives us a way of understanding his historical context, because several major historical events in the life of God's people happened during Isaiah's ministry and are actually witnessed to in the writings of 1st Isaiah. Perhaps the most significant is the Syro-Ephraimite War, which is when Syria and Israel attacked Judah. I know that most of the time I have avoided a lot of the politics of what goes on during this period of history in the Bible, because palace intrigue and worldly politics are usually not the focus of the Bible. But it may be very surprising to you to hear this. What? Israel joining with a foreign nation, Syria, and attacking Judah, attacking Jerusalem? That seems very weird maybe to us, but it really shows you how broken up the divided kingdoms were. Isaiah chapter 7, verses 1 through 9 details this conflict. And Isaiah comes forward and boldly proclaims, "This will not stand," which is always nice to hear. But maybe as a king isn't exactly what you hope to hear, because King Ahaz and all of Judah, they're still frightened. They are still worried about this overwhelming power coming from the north, this combined forces of Syria and Israel. So Isaiah goes before King Ahaz and says, "Ask God for a sign and God will give it to you." But Ahaz is a little reluctant. So let's turn to Isaiah 7. This is one of perhaps one of the most well-known passages from Isaiah, so you might be familiar with it. Again, the Lord spoke to Ahaz, saying, "Ask a sign of the Lord your God. Let it be as deep as Sheol or high as heaven." But Ahaz said, "I will not ask it. I will not put the Lord to the test." Then Isaiah said, "Hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary mortals, that you weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman is with child, and shall bear a son, and shall name him Emmanuel. He shall eat curds and honey by the time he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land before whose two kings you are in dread will be deserted. The Lord will bring on you and on your people and on your ancestral house such days as has not come since the day that Ephraim departed from Judah." And here, Ephraim is just another name for Israel. It's why it's sometimes called the Syrio-Ephraimite War. And there are multiple layers of what's going on here in the passage. And this is a great passage from 1st Isaiah that is going to reveal a lot of the work of biblical interpretation that we're going to be doing together through this Bible study. And so first, I kind of want to look here at the historical context of what's happening in Isaiah's ministry and in Judah's history. As you heard, Isaiah predicts the birth of a son from presumably among one of the young brides that King Ahaz had taken as wife. Now, presumably, kind of from the context you get here, she's already pregnant. Yet what Isaiah is doing here is giving a kind of an expiration date. Isaiah is saying that by the time that the child, which has not yet been born, is weaned, that the war will be over. When Isaiah says when he can eat curds and honey, that's kind of a euphemism for saying when the child has been weaned. But that isn't all that Isaiah does here, because this child is something more than just an expiration date. This child will know good from evil by the time he is weaned. Maybe something quite important. Maybe you remember King Ahaz is undoubtedly one of the worst kings of Israel. The Bible bears witness to the fact that he participated in live human sacrifice. So maybe Isaiah is looking forward to this new king, this child king, who would perhaps know good from evil. And what is more, Isaiah boldly names this child, names the son Emmanuel, which you might know means God with us. Now, interestingly enough, Ahaz had no sons whose names were given Emmanuel. So what could it mean for this prophecy, this sign that God gives Ahaz, that everything is going to be all right? Well, a very common interpretation these days is that Isaiah is actually speaking about the child Hezekiah, who would be king at the end of Isaiah's ministry. And you may remember, he is remembered as being one of the most faithful kings, being dedicated to the sole worship of God. And indeed, the war with Syria and Israel does seem to correspond with his young childhood. And there even seem to be stories that Isaiah and Hezekiah, they were close. Certainly passages from Kings and Isaiah suggest that the two men were friends. Now, another interpretation which has long been held by Christians is that Isaiah is speaking of Jesus. You probably know this passage because it's often read around Christmas or Advent. Now, this is a more tricky claim because, I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure that Isaiah is directly speaking of Jesus, that he's thinking of this Jewish man who comes a century later, who would be God incarnate. But what I will say is that the Spirit moves in each of us. And maybe the Spirit of God's revelation was of this child Jesus, Emmanuel. Or maybe God was able to inspire a message that speaks both to the context of Isaiah and Hezekiah's day, as well as to Jesus' day. Now, certainly, there are a lot of passages in Isaiah that have been interpreted to be about the coming Christ. And a lot of them are in 2nd Isaiah, and we're going to look very closely at those sections, at many of these passages. But when we do that as a group, we're trying to be good and faithful to God's word. And because of this fact, we're going to look at things first from a historical context and then from a Christological perspective secondly. And this is in part because no matter how much we may want to make these passages about Jesus, these prophecies about Jesus, if they are prophecies about Jesus, then we confess that they work both ways. They work both historically and in a Christological sense. So to keep things nice and neat and tidy, and dare I say chronological, we're always going to talk about historical significance of the passage, historical context of the passage first, and then after about the way that these passages may contribute to our understanding of who Christ is. Now, Hezekiah as a king, he was a pretty big deal. Isaiah was involved in hyping up his reign from before he was even born. You may recall that Hezekiah, as I said earlier, he's one of the few good kings who worshipped the God of Israel alone. He was also a great builder, responsible for construction like the walls of Jerusalem and an aqueduct. He was also involved in gaining a small measure of independence for Judah from their Assyrian suzerain. And for the historical Isaiah, this really was the culmination of Hezekiah's reign and the fulfillment of his prophecies about him. If you want to get an idea of one of these prophecies about Hezekiah, take a look at this passage from Isaiah 32. It was a lot of expectations to live into if you have a prophet out there making these kinds of proclamations. Yet, near the end of Hezekiah's reign, perhaps even in the last years of Isaiah's life, Hezekiah would perhaps falter in the prophet's eyes. In chapter 39, the last chapter that is attributed to 1st Isaiah, we hear that Hezekiah receives envoys from Babylon. And when this happened, almost like Isaiah can almost like feel the doom looming, Isaiah comes and warns Hezekiah about these men from Babylon. Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, "Hear the word of the Lord of hosts. Days are coming when all that is in your house and in which your ancestors have stored up unto this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord. Some of your own sons who are born to you shall be taken away. They shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." Then Hezekiah said to Isaiah, The word of the Lord that you have spoken is good. For he thought, there will be peace and security in my days. I've shared this passage a number of times because it is quite startling to me. Hezekiah's ambivalence about a disaster that would befall his house, just because he won't still be alive around to see the worst consequences of it, honestly makes me kind of mad. I suspect that it disappointed Isaiah, and it's how the historical Isaiah's ministry ends. This is the last story about him from Kings. This is the last part from First Isaiah. And that's a bit sad, isn't it? At least in the context of the book Isaiah, it would seem to be perhaps the pivotal moment that results in exile, because it's the last passage before we turn to chapter 40 and 2nd Isaiah and a new message, a new context. Now, we are going to be discussing 2nd Isaiah in a lot more detail in the weeks to come, but I did want to mention, just sort of do an overview about what we're looking at. 2nd Isaiah, as I mentioned earlier, we're looking at chapters 40 through 55, and if you want, maybe sit down and just read that whole section all the way through, or if you have access to an audiobook, you can listen to. And I know of some free online resources if you want to listen to the Bible, I can get you access to. But like a lot of like the rest of the book, and like the other big prophetic books like Jeremiah and Ezekiel, it's thematically it's broken up into a lot of different sections. The prophet wanders from theme to theme, but you see them interwoven. So because we're not doing a narrative study, we're not going to necessarily sit down and just read them all the way through. So sometimes it can be nice to do that, read or listen to them all the way through to get the overarching themes. What I do want to mention is the primary message of this middle section. And the main theme, as we look at this, is one of consolation. That God is comforting God's people in exile. And that God promises to restore them to their land. Now, naturally, such proclamations would have made the most sense, if we're talking about dating and history again, make the most sense during the time of exile, running anywhere from 597 to 539 BCE. However, 2nd Isaiah's use of Cyrus the Great by name as the means of the liberation of the Jews suggests that part or all of the composition of 2nd Isaiah may have been sort of later in that time frame. In addition to the major theme of consolation and promise of restoration, another major theme in 2nd Isaiah is the proclamation of judgment against the nations. Now, 1st Isaiah has words of judgment for both God's people and the foreign nations who oppress them. But 2nd Isaiah only have words of comfort for God's people and reserves the words of judgment for foreign nations alone. Now, these sections that are condemning these foreign nations, they are often coupled with another common theme for 2nd Isaiah, which is the absurdity of idols. And these two themes, they're paired together for a reason. It is quite significant, and it really shows us something that was quite unique about God's people during this time of exile. Now, normally, when a people were conquered, their civilization, it went away. It ceased to be. And that's not so much that everybody was simply massacred at the end of a war, but it's that they would give up their unique things, the things that, say, made them Akkadian or Canaanite. Those things were put away when, say, the Chaldeans or the Israelites conquered you and your lands. And this went for the worship of God, of their pantheon of gods as well. When conquered people were conquered, they saw that conquest of their nation was a defeat of their gods also. Gods and pantheons were often associated with national identities. So when this happened, the normative practice for people were for them to forsake the gods of their ancestors and worship the new gods who clearly were divinely ordained in this conquest. And in fact, the defeat of a nation was seen as a defeat of your gods at the hands of those foreign gods. But this wasn't the case with the people of Israel. God's people never forsook their worship or their dedication to their single, always sovereign God, in large part because they simply didn't believe that those foreign gods even existed. So a major interwoven theme that we're going to look at in 2nd Isaiah are these two realities: futility of other God worship and the condemnation of these foreign conquering nations. Now, 2nd Isaiah is also known for its great poetic literature, poetic license, particularly drawing on themes which I'm calling creation's response to restoration and justice. These are the passages in Isaiah where we get all that lovely imagery of mountains being made low and valleys being raised up, lush green growth in the desert, and peace among the animal kingdom. Another facet of this poetic skill is that something we might call the songs of God's servant, or the songs of Isaiah's servant. Perhaps you might know a little bit about this. You might have heard it called the suffering servant of Isaiah. And that is how it's this hypothetical person is kind of described in Isaiah. There are passages that are about suffering, but it isn't only about suffering. There are two major ones about the suffering of the servant, but others that don't have that, a suffering context. So there are other callings to this servant. Now, who exactly this servant is has been hotly debated for decades, maybe even centuries. Perhaps it is the author. Some places it seems to imply that. In other places it seems to imply that the servant isn't a singular person, but sort of a metaphorical person that's supposed to represent the whole nation of Israel. Other times, the context seems to suggest that the servant is really just one person who is bearing, say, all the burdens of a nation. Perhaps even some hypothetical future person. And this brings us to another popular interpretation, that the servant of Isaiah is Jesus, again, foretold. And we will be unpacking these questions and many others over the next few weeks. But to end our time together now, I want to just briefly look at 3rd Isaiah, that final section, which encompasses chapters 56 through 66. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the themes are very similar to 2nd Isaiah, but the context seems to have changed slightly. The audience seems to now have returned to the land of Judah. They are actually in the process of rebuilding. And of course, specifically, they would be rebuilding the temple. And this is actually alluded to in chapter 66, verse 1. And we can reasonably date the construction on the second temple to have taken place between 520 and 515 BCE. So we can fairly reasonably date this section. If 2nd Isaiah is full of hope and promise, 3rd Isaiah wrestles with the reality of that return to the land, and that that return did not quite live up to everybody's expectations. 2nd Isaiah is full of all these amazing images. The deserts are going to gush forth with springs, and all creation are going to, lions and lambs are going to lie down together. Could any kind of return to the land ever have lived into those types of expectations? God's people, the reality was they returned to a harsh land, to an economically oppressive conditions. There were ruins throughout the land. And perhaps most significantly, there is a resurgence of the pagan rituals that had long been indigenous in the land. And so those are some of the themes that sort of get woven in. The glorious deliverance that is promised in 2nd Isaiah, according to 3rd Isaiah, it will soon be realized. It is coming. And the author also implores God's people to return to right relationship with God and with neighbor to help usher in this new golden age. And 3rd Isaiah also condemns the oppressors and the other God worshippers, as we might expect. So this has provided you, I hope, a pretty good cursory overview of the book of Isaiah, the context in which the different sections of it which were written, and the major themes that we see emerge from the text. We can see that this book as a whole provides some pretty clear themes, narratives, prophetic voices that emerge. There does seem to be a trajectory here of before exile, during exile, and after exile. And we're going to dive in a little bit more deeply into that middle section, during exile, for our Bible study. Some of these prophecies that we will hear come from Isaiah will sound very familiar to us. They will sound like Christ to us. And we are going to closely examine many of those passages as we engage in the interpretation and reinterpretation of Isaiah, as many have done before. But for now, that is all. Thank you for joining me, and peace be with you all as we start this journey on the book of Isaiah.